Let me tell you about the day I signed away my life's work. I sat in a glass conference room, a cheap pen in my hand, and put my name on a document that legally declared I was worth less than a tenth of the company I built from my kitchen table. My own lawyer called it career suicide. My business partner's smug grin said he agreed. But what none of them saw, what they were all too arrogant, too impatient, too dismissive to look for, was buried in paragraph 17. A single sentence I had crafted. A silent tripwire. And as I handed him the signed papers, giving him 90% of everything I knew, I was the only person in that room who wasn't making a mistake. This isn't just a story about business. It's a story about identity. About what happens when the person who sees your value the least is the one standing right next to you, sharing your logo, your bank account, your dream. His name was David. We met in a co-working space 7 years ago. I was the one with the prototype, the user flows scribbled on napkins, the vision for an app that could simplify remote team management. He was the guy with the slick pitch, the investor contacts, the confident handshake. I was the engine, he was the salesman. And for a long time, that partnership worked. We complemented each other. Or so I thought. The company, which we named Kennedy Core, grew. We moved from that shared space to a real office. We hired a team. But the dynamic, it began to shift. Slowly. Insidiously. My role, which had been co-founder and chief product officer, started to get quietly rebranded in meetings with VCs. David would call me the creative heart. Or our brilliant idea girl. The language was patronizing, but wrapped in a compliment, so I let it slide. I was busy building. He was busy building his narrative. And that narrative was slowly writing me out of the story I had authored. The first real fracture came during our series of funding round. David took the lead on all negotiations. When the term sheets came back, I saw the proposed cap table. His equity share was significantly larger than mine. His reasoning? He was the face of the company, the primary fundraiser, the strategic lead. My contributions, he argued, while foundational, were now part of a machine others could run. I was being phased out in plain sight with a smile. And that's when I stopped seeing a partner. I started seeing an adversary. That's when I began thinking about paragraph 17. The pressure to formalize our now unequal partnership came to a head 18 months after that funding round. We were profitable, growing, and attracting acquisition whispers. David called it streamlining for the future. He wanted a new, clean operating agreement. One that reflected, as he put it, the current and future realities of the business. His proposal was brutal in its simplicity. A new equity split. 90% for him, 10% for me. He laid it out in his corner office, the one with the skyline view I never got. Look, it's not personal, he said, pouring himself a whiskey, not offering me one. It's business optics. Investors, potential buyers, they see a single decisive captain at the helm. A split like ours looks like indecision. It devalues the whole company. This way, he gestured with a glass, you're still a millionaire on paper. You're taken care of. And the company gets the valuation it deserves. The audacity was breathtaking. It wasn't an offer. It was a mugging disguised as a negotiation. My mind raced. The code base, every elegant line of it, was mine. The user interface, the core functionality that got us our first 10,000 clients, came from my all-nighters. He'd handled sales, partnerships, the schmoozing. Important, sure. But replaceable. What I had built was not. I felt a cold fury settle in my stomach, replacing the initial shock. This was the culmination of all those idea girl comments, all the times he talked over me in board meetings, all the credit he'd subtly redirected. He wasn't just stealing my company, he was retroactively erasing my creation. I played for time. I said I needed to think, to consult my own counsel. He nodded, that smug, paternalistic nod. Of course. Get your lawyer to look it over. But just so you know, the board is aligned on this. And the clock is ticking. There's a lot of interest in us right now, and this instability, it's a liability. It was a threat. Sign or be the reason the deal falls apart. I left and went straight to Eleanor, my personal attorney for a decade. She's fierce, brilliant, and doesn't suffer fools. I slid the proposal across her desk. She read it in silence, her expression growing darker with each page. She finished, took off her glasses, and pinched the bridge of her nose. "Maya," she said, her voice low and serious. "This isn't a proposal. This is a surrender document. They're not asking you to be a partner. They're asking you to be a footnote. If you sign this, you are agreeing that your last 7 years of work, your intellectual property, your very identity in this space, is worth exactly 10%. You will have zero operational control. You can be removed from the board at his whim. You are signing over your child for pocket money. Do not sign this. We will fight it." I looked out her window, which had a much less impressive view than David's. "What if fighting it destroys the company?" I asked. "He has the board. He'll spin it as me being greedy, emotional, trying to sink the ship out of spite. The acquisition talks will vanish. The value plummets. He walks away bruised, but I walk away with nothing but a legal bill and a reputation as a difficult woman who couldn't play ball." Eleanor slammed a hand on the desk. "So you take the nothing. You walk away with your integrity, and you start again. Signing this is professional suicide. It tells the entire industry you can be rolled over. It's not just about this company. It's about every future opportunity. Don't do it." I turned back to her, the cold plan that had been a vague shadow in my mind since the Series A meeting now snapping into sharp, crystalline focus. "Eleanor," I said, my voice unnervingly calm, "what if I want you to help me improve the document?" She stared at me. "Improve it? There's nothing to improve. It's a trap." "No," I said. "It's a theater. He wants a performance of my submission. So, I'll give him one. But I'm writing the climax." I leaned forward. "I need you to draft an addendum. A single clause. We'll bury it deep in the definitions, or the miscellaneous provisions. Make it look like standard, boring legalese. But it needs to do one very specific, very powerful thing." I explained the kernel of my idea. The legal mechanism. The trigger. Her initial skepticism melted into intense, calculated focus. She started asking rapid-fire questions, probing the logic, testing it against contract law. A slow, grim smile spread across her face. It was the smile of a master chess player who's just been shown a devastating, hidden move. "It's aggressive," she finally said. "It's borderline diabolical. And if it's worded perfectly, if we anchor it to the right precedents, it might just hold. But Maya, the risk. If he or his lawyers catch it." "They won't," I said, the certainty in my voice surprising even me. "He's too arrogant. He's already celebrating. He thinks he's won. His lawyers are bill-by-the-hour yes-men who are reviewing this for his protection, not for traps set by the person they think they've already defeated. They'll gloss over the back pages. Everyone overlooks the quiet one in the room." We spent the next week crafting Clause 17. It couldn't be too obvious. It couldn't be a poison pill or a standard non-compete. It had to be a sleeper agent, a clause that lay dormant, harmless, until a very specific condition was met. A condition I was sure David would eventually fulfill. We worded it in the dry, convoluted language of contractual definitions, tying it to intellectual property ownership transfers and change of control events. On the surface, it looked like a minor technical provision about asset classification. In reality, it was a landmine with my finger on the trigger. The day of the signing arrived. I walked into that glass conference room feeling a surreal calm. David was there, beaming, surrounded by his lawyers. My lawyer, Eleanor, sat stiffly beside me, a folder containing the modified agreement in front of her. David pushed a copy toward me. "Clean version, just for you," he said magnanimously. I didn't smile. I just opened it, turned past the glaring, bold numbers on the equity split, and found my way to the back, to paragraph 17. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat screaming, "Don't do this," but my hand was steady. I picked up the cheap pen. I looked David in the eye. And I signed my name under the clause that would either destroy me or reclaim everything. The ink was still drying when he reached out to shake my hand. "What would you have done in that moment? Would you have trusted the plan? Or would you have walked away? Let me know in the comments below. For 2 years after I signed that paper, I played a part. I was the agreeable, sidelined co-founder. The idea girl who'd accepted her small, quiet corner. David would pat himself on the back for how smoothly the transition had gone. But every single day, in the background of my mind, a silent clock was ticking. I wasn't waiting for an apology, or for him to see my value. I was waiting for his greed to reach its natural, inevitable conclusion. I was waiting for him to try and sell what wasn't his to sell. And when the email blast went out to the entire company announcing a transformative acquisition, I didn't feel anger. I felt the calm, precise click of a lock turning. Game on. Life under the new agreement was a masterclass in psychological erosion. I had an office, but it was away from the product and engineering teams. My title remained, but my decisions were now recommendations that went to a committee David chaired. I was invited to board meetings as a courtesy, but my vote was symbolic. The team, our team, treated me with a gentle, pitying respect. They knew what had happened. The story had leaked, of course. David's version, that I had voluntarily stepped back to focus on creative pursuits, and he had generously structured a deal to take on the heavy burden of leadership. I was the founder who'd gotten tired. He was the savior stepping up. The hardest part wasn't the disrespect. It was the isolation. The company I had birthed hummed along around me, a creature I no longer recognized. David's strategy was all aggressive growth, chasing vanity metrics to inflate the valuation for a quick exit. He diluted the core product that users loved with bloated features for enterprise clients. He fired key engineers who questioned the tech debt, replacing them with cheaper, less experienced contractors. He was strip mining the company's soul for a shiny bottom line. And I had to watch, silently from the sidelines. Every bad decision was a knife twist. Every piece of positive PR about David's leadership was salt in the wound. My only solace was Clause 17. It became my secret compass. Eleanor and I had quarterly, clandestine check-ins, always off-site, paid for from my personal account, not the company's. We'd review the company's public filings, any changes to the operating agreement David might try to sneak through. We were watching for the one thing that would activate my clause, a change of control event. That was the legal trigger we'd baked into paragraph 17. If David, as the majority owner, ever tried to sell the company, merge it, or transfer controlling interest, the clause would awaken. The clause itself was a work of legal misdirection. Its heading was boring. Section 17.08, IP asset classification in transfer scenarios. In essence, it stated that in the event of a change of control, all pre-existing, foundational intellectual property, specifically defined as the codebase, algorithms, and design systems extant at the time of the original operating agreement, the one I'd just signed, would be subject to a separate, prior licensing agreement. A license that was exclusively and perpetually held by me. And this license had a unique feature. It was non-transferable without my express written consent, and it contained a reversion trigger. If the company was transferred without this consent being formally obtained and attached to the sale documents, the license would immediately terminate, and full, unencumbered ownership of that foundational IP would revert back to me, personally. In simple terms, if David sold the company without getting my specific, attached permission for the new owners to use my original work, he would be selling them a hollow shell. The very heart of the product, the thing that made it valuable, would legally snap back into my hands. He'd be selling a car after the engine had quietly been removed and wheeled back into my garage. David's lawyers had missed it because they were looking for hostile clauses, non-competes, drag-along rights, tag-along rights. My clause wasn't hostile, it was bureaucratic. It looked like dull, procedural housekeeping about how to categorize assets during a theoretical future audit. They assumed it was there for accounting purposes. They never asked the critical question, who does this bureaucracy ultimately benefit? For 2 years, I lived a double life. Publicly, I was Maya, the diminished founder, occasionally giving interviews about the early days with a wistful smile. Privately, I was a strategist, monitoring, waiting. I used my remaining internal access to keep a pulse on the sale rumors. I saw the non-disclosure agreements flow in from big tech and private equity firms. I saw the financial models getting prepared, models that grossly overvalued the company based on my proprietary technology. David was polishing the apple, not knowing there was a worm coiled at its core. Then it happened. On a Tuesday morning, an all-hands meeting was called with no agenda. My stomach tightened. I knew. David took the stage in the main atrium, the same place we'd celebrated our first major client. He was beaming, flanked by men in suits I didn't recognize. His voice boomed with triumph. Team, today is a historic day. After a competitive process, I am thrilled to announce that Kennedy Core has entered into a definitive agreement to be acquired by Kronos Technologies. The room erupted in a mix of cheers and stunned silence. This is a validation of our journey, our vision, and our value. For our early employees, this is a life-changing event. Your faith is being rewarded. He went on about synergies, growth, and new horizons. He thanked the team, the board, his mentors. He did not thank me. My name wasn't mentioned once. I stood at the back of the crowd, my face a mask of calm. I felt 100 eyes flicker towards me, then quickly away, awkwardly. I was a ghost at my own funeral. He announced the deal was expected to close in 60 days, subject to standard regulatory approvals. 60 days. That was my window. That was the timer on the landmine. As the crowd dispersed, buzzing with talk of payouts and new jobs, David caught my eye across the room. He gave me a small, tight smile, not of camaraderie, but of finality. It was the smile of a man who believes he has just written the last chapter. He walked over, the suits trailing behind him like disciples. Maya, he said, his voice oozing a synthetic sympathy. A big day. I know this might be bittersweet for you, but look, your 10%, it's going to be a very, very nice number. You'll be set. You can finally do whatever you want. He was giving me my payoff, my consolation prize, and my dismissal all in one breath. I looked at him, and for the first time in years, I let a real smile touch my lips. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who holds the only copy of the map. Congratulations, David, I said, my voice clear and steady. It's quite an achievement. I paused, letting the ambiguity hang in the air. I'm sure the due diligence process will be thorough. His smile faltered for a microsecond, a crack in the facade. A flicker of something annoyance? A hint of doubt? Of course, he said, recovering. All standard stuff. Our books are clean. He turned to the lead suit, a stern-looking man with a sharp gaze. This is Maya, our other founder. She's largely been focused on special projects for a while. The suit nodded at me, his eyes already looking past me, scanning the room for more important people. I just nodded back. Special projects. Yes, he had no idea how special. The waiting was over. Now it was time to see if my single, buried sentence could withstand the billion-dollar scrutiny of a top-tier acquisition team. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. All that was left was for them to take one more step forward. I walked back to my isolated office, closed the door, and picked up my personal phone. My hand was perfectly steady. I dialed a number from memory. It rang twice. Eleanor, I said the moment she answered. There was no need for greetings. The announcement just happened. Kronos Technologies. 60-day close. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, then a long, purposeful silence. I could almost hear her mind shifting from defense to offense. All right, she finally said, her voice all business. The clock starts now. Do not engage. Do not sign anything they send you. Forward every single email, every document, to me immediately. It's time to see what their thorough due diligence is really made of. So, what do you think happens next? Do the billion-dollar lawyers at Kronos spot my clause, or does their confidence blind them too? Could a single paragraph really derail a 9-figure deal? Drop your prediction below. And to find out what happens when the acquisition lawyers finally open that document and get to page 38, hit subscribe. Part 3 is where the legal war begins. The first document arrived in my inbox 48 hours later. It was a PDF, over 200 pages thick. The subject line read, Kronos Acquisition, Founder Representation and Warranty Questionnaire. This was the boilerplate, the opening salvo in the due diligence process. It was a minefield of legal questions designed to make me swear, under penalty of law, that I had disclosed every potential problem with the company. David and his team would have their own set to complete. But mine was different, because buried in my standard answers, I would have to tell the truth about paragraph 17. Not upfront, not flagged. But if they asked the right question, I was legally obligated to point them to it. This was the dangerous part. This was where my sleeper agent could be discovered before it ever woke up. I had to walk a razor's edge, tell no lies, but reveal nothing voluntarily. One wrong word, and the entire plan would collapse before it began. Eleanor and I developed a protocol. Every document, every email from Kronos' legal team or David's lawyers went directly to her. She would dissect it, draft a response in her most neutral, cooperative legalese, and send it back to me. I would review it, and only then would I hit send for my account. We were a single, cautious entity. The initial questionnaire was a beast. It asked about everything from pending lawsuits to environmental regulations we might have violated. Section 12 was titled Intellectual Property. My pulse thrummed as I read it. 12.4. List all licenses, agreements, or encumbrances related to the company's core intellectual property. This was it. The direct question. I couldn't omit Clause 17. It was a license agreement, embedded in the operating agreement itself. To not list it would be fraud. Eleanor's drafted response was a masterpiece of minimalism. Under 12.4, she wrote, See Company Operating Agreement, dated date of signing, Section 17.08, regarding IP asset classification and licensing protocols in defined transfer scenarios. That was it.
No explanation. No highlighting.
We buried it in a list with a dozen other minor, irrelevant licenses for outdated software libraries. We presented it not as a threat, but as a boring procedural footnote. The waiting after that email was excruciating. For a week, nothing. Then, a reply from the lead Kronos counsel, a man named Richard Vance. His email was terse. Questionnaire response. Item 12.4. Please provide full text of Section 17.08 of referenced operating agreement for our review. My heart jumped into my throat. They'd seen it. They'd plucked it from the list. This was the moment. Eleanor remained ice calm. This is good, she said. They're doing their job. They're checking a box. Now we see how deep they look. She drafted the response, attaching a clean PDF of the entire operating agreement with a note. Requested section provided within full context of agreement for completeness. We weren't hiding the document. We were drowning the clause in it. 2 days later, another email from Vance. This one was longer. We have reviewed Section 17.08. The language appears to establish a conditional, founder-held license with reversionary rights upon a change of control event. Please confirm our understanding. Furthermore, please provide a copy of the separate, referenced licensing agreement between founder Maya Chun and the company. This was the critical fork in the road. They had read it. They had understood its basic mechanism. But they had made a fatal assumption. They assumed this separate licensing agreement was another, physical document. That was the genius of our drafting. We had written the clause to reference a separate license, but the clause itself, in its full text, contained the entire license. It was all right there in paragraph 17. We had created a phantom document to chase. It was a legal mirage. Eleanor's response was key. She wrote back, Thank you for your review. Your understanding of the conditional mechanism is correct. Regarding the separate licensing agreement, the terms of the license are fully encapsulated within the reference section 17.08 itself. There is no physically distinct document. The license is operative as written within the four corners of the company's governing agreement. The silence that followed was heavier than before. I imagined Vance and his team rereading the clause, realizing their error, and now examining it with fresh, more suspicious eyes. The due diligence process ground on, but a new, tense layer was added. Requests for documents became more frequent, more pointed. They asked for all my employment contracts, all my invention assignment agreements from day one. They were trying to build a timeline to see if I had somehow retroactively inserted this clause. But we were ready. Every document Eleanor had ever drafted for me was pristine, consistent, and predated the final operating agreement. Then, the inevitable happened.
David called me.
His voice on the line was strained, the fake cheerfulness gone.
Maya.
Richard Vance from Kronos is asking some very detailed questions about the operating agreement, about your clause. I kept my voice light, innocent. Which clause, David? There are a lot of them. Don't play dumb, he snapped, his composure cracking. The one in the back. The IP thing. What is this? Why is it suddenly an issue? It's part of the agreement you asked me to sign, David, I said, letting a hint of steel into my tone. Your lawyers reviewed it. My lawyer reviewed it. It's just standard IP protection for a founder. I'm sure it's fine. It's not fine, he nearly shouted. They're calling it a material contingency. They want it cleared before close.
Cleared.
What does that even mean? I could hear the panic rising in his voice. The multi-million-dollar payout he saw slipping away. I'm sure your legal team can explain it to them, I said calmly. It's just a formality. I hung up before he could reply. The pressure was shifting from me to him. His own lawyers, the ones who'd missed the clause, were now under the microscope. He would be furious with them, and they, in turn, would become defensive, likely downplaying the clause's significance to cover their own oversight. This created a beautiful friction, Kronos's lawyers growing more concerned, David's lawyers growing more dismissive. The next communication was a formal meeting request. A conference call. Attendees: Richard Vance, Kronos lead counsel, David and his lead lawyer, Eleanor and myself. The topic: Discussion Re. Section 17.08 of Kennedy Core OA. This was the showdown. The call began with a chilly politeness. Vance got straight to the point. We need to resolve this provision. As drafted, it creates uncertainty over clear title to a core company asset post-acquisition. We require one of two paths. First, a full waiver and release of the reversionary rights from Ms. Chun, signed and attached to the closing documents. Or second, a formal amendment to the operating agreement, striking 17.08 in its entirety prior to close. David's lawyer, a man named Greg, jumped in, his tone jovial and dismissive. Richard, with all due respect, we've looked at this. It's a standard founder protection clause. The reversion trigger is so narrow, it's practically theoretical. It's meant to protect Maya in a hostile takeover scenario, not a friendly acquisition like this. We can provide a side letter affirming it doesn't apply here. Eleanor's voice cut through, cool and precise. A side letter stating it doesn't apply would be an interpretation of the contract. The clause, as written, is unambiguous. It triggers on a change of control. This acquisition is, by definition, a change of control. A side letter won't change the operative language. My client will not provide a waiver for a right explicitly granted to her by the company's governing document. The silence on the line was profound. David finally spoke, his voice tight. Maya, be reasonable. This is a deal that benefits everyone. Just sign the waiver. It's a technicality. I took a slow breath. This was my first real move on the board. David Gregg, I said. It's not a technicality to me. It's my only remaining protection in the company I started. You asked me to sign a document that reduced my role to almost nothing. This clause is what made that remotely palatable. You can't now ask me to give up the one piece of security I negotiated for. That doesn't seem reasonable to me. Vance spoke again. Ms. Chun, what is your intention with this clause? What would it take to resolve this? Eleanor answered for me, as we'd planned. My client's intention is for the agreement she signed to be honored. The path to resolution is straightforward. The clause provides a mechanism for the license to transfer seamlessly in a change of control. My client's express written consent must be obtained and appended to the sale documents. That consent is negotiable. It is not, however, a simple waiver. It is a new agreement. I could almost hear the gears turning in Vance's head and the cold dread solidifying in David's. They finally understood. Paragraph 17 wasn't a bug, it was a feature. And I held the only key to disabling it. The due diligence war wasn't about finding the problem anymore. It was about who would blink first in negotiating the price to make it go away. And I had no intention of blinking. After the call ended, my hands were trembling. Not from fear, but from the sheer adrenaline of the confrontation. Eleanor called me immediately on a private line. "They're cornered," she said, a note of triumph in her voice. "Vance knows he can't recommend Kronos close with this hanging over the IP.
David knows his payday is stuck.
They have to come to the table. Now we wait for the offer." The offer came not from David, but from Richard Vance himself, copying everyone. It was a draft consent and license confirmation agreement. In exchange for my consent to transfer the license to Kronos, they offered a one-time payment. A consideration for cooperation. The number was substantial. It was more money than I'd ever had at once. It was a bribe to go away quietly. David would get his sale, Kronos would get clean IP, and I'd get a richer footnote. So what would you do? Take the multi-million-dollar buyout and walk away, or see the plan through to its absolute, risky end? Let me know in the comments. In Part 4, the real negotiation begins, and the true cost of underestimating the idea girl is finally calculated. Subscribe to see the number that makes even David gasp. I stared at the number on the screen. $4.5 million. That was Kronos' opening bid for my consent, for my silence, for me to vanish and let history be rewritten. It was a life-changing sum. It was also an insult. It was a tiny fraction of the acquisition price, a rounding error to them, a cost of doing business. They weren't paying for my idea. They were paying for me to be quiet. David, of course, emailed me separately, urging me to take it. "Maya, this is more than fair. Don't let your emotions ruin this for everyone."
But this was no longer about emotion.
It was about calculus. I had the one component their entire deal needed to function, and I was about to teach them the true meaning of a non-negotiable asset. The game had shifted from legal defense to a high-stakes auction, and I was the only seller. Eleanor and I met in her secure conference room, the draft agreement printed out before us. "They're treating it like a nuisance fee," she said, tapping the $4.5 million figure. "Standard playbook. Offer enough to make the problem disappear without acknowledging its real value. This is where we reset the board." We crafted our response together. It wasn't a counteroffer. It was a statement of principles. Eleanor sent back a redlined version of their agreement. We struck the payment clause entirely. In its place, we inserted new language. The preamble changed from "in consideration for cooperation" to "in recognition of the foundational and irreplaceable value of the licensed intellectual property, which constitutes the core asset of the acquisition." Then we laid out our terms. Not for a one-time payment, but for a restructure of the entire deal as it pertained to me. Our demand was threefold. First, my 10% equity would not be cashed out in the acquisition. Instead, it would be converted directly into equity in the acquiring entity, Kronos Technologies, at the same valuation implied by the sale. I wasn't selling my share. I was trading it up into the parent company. Second, the consent would be granted in perpetuity, but it would be attached to a newly created, paid advisory role for me, a seat on the product advisory board of the new Kinetic Core division within Kronos, with a meaningful annual retainer. And third, the kicker, a royalty. A small percentage of net revenue generated by the core Kinetic Core product platform, in perpetuity, for as long as the underlying IP I created was in use. We were no longer asking for a payoff. We were demanding to be recognized as the permanent, vested origin point of the asset. We were turning my hidden clause from a legal obstacle into a lever to reclaim not just money, but a legacy. The reaction was volcanic. David called me, screaming this time, pure, unfiltered rage. "Have you lost your mind? A royalty? An advisory board? You're trying to sink the deal. You greedy, vindictive." I hung up on him. He was now a non-factor, just noise. The real conversation was between Eleanor and Richard Vance. Vance's response was a masterclass in corporate hostility disguised as professionalism. He rejected our proposal in its entirety, called it unprecedented and unreasonable. He asserted that my original 10% was already being fairly compensated in the cash payout of the acquisition, and that my contributions were historical, not ongoing. He threatened to advise Kronos to walk away from the deal entirely, citing seller intransigence and material, unresolved liability. This was the pressure point. The bluff. Would they really kill a 9-figure acquisition over my clause? Eleanor didn't blink. Her reply was calm and devastating. She attached 2 exhibits. The first was a sworn declaration from our first lead engineer, testifying that over 70% of the current revenue-generating codebase was directly derived from my original architecture and could not be easily replaced. The second was a market analysis from an independent expert, estimating the cost and timeline, 18 to 24 months, for Kronos to try and build a competing product from scratch, during which time they would lose all market advantage. Her covering email was short. Richard, walking away is, of course, Kronos' prerogative. Should they do so, my client will retain her 10% of Kennedy Core and her F ownership of the foundational IP via reversion. She will then be free to license that IP to any other party, including Kronos' competitors, or to restart operations with a clean slate. The attached estimates quantify the competitive risk of that scenario. We believe our proposal fairly reflects the ongoing strategic value of the asset you are seeking to acquire. We are prepared to discuss its parameters. It was checkmate on the bluff. We had called it. We weren't just a problem. We were the problem. And we had just shown them the devastating cost of not solving it. The silence lasted 4 days. It was the longest 4 days of my life. I didn't sleep. I ran through every possible outcome, from total victory to a messy, bankrupting lawsuit. Then the email arrived. Not from Vance. From a senior vice president of corporate development at Kronos, a woman named Annee Petrova. The tone was completely different. It requested a direct, in-person meeting between herself, me, and Eleanor.
No David.
No other lawyers. The location was a private club in the city. This was the real negotiation. The meeting was cordial, but intensely focused. Annee Petrova was sharp, direct, and looked at me not with anger, but with a calculating respect. "You built a very clever trap, Miss Chun," she said, stirring her tea. "And you sprung it at the perfect time. I'm not interested in the drama between you and your partner. I'm interested in one thing: securing a clear, clean, and productive path for this technology inside Kronos. Your current proposal, while creative, is a non-starter for our accounting and governance. But you've clearly demonstrated you are not a person to be bought off with a check. So, let's talk about what is actually possible." What followed was a 3-hour dissection of value. We negotiated point by point. The Kronos equity swap was dismissed, too complex. The perpetual royalty was scaled back to a 15-year term, tied specifically to the existing product, not future derivatives. The advisory role was agreed to, but as a formal, 2-year consultancy with a defined scope and a healthy retainer. But the core of the deal, the financial heart of it, was the buyout number. They would buy my consent and a clean, transferable license. But the number was no longer a nuisance fee. Annee presented their counterproposal. It was a structured settlement. A significant upfront payment, larger than their first offer. Plus, the 15-year royalty. Plus, the consultancy fee. The total potential value was an order of magnitude larger than $4.5 million. It was a number that represented not just my 10%, but a premium for the IP itself. It was a number that acknowledged, in hard dollars, that David had been wrong. That I was not just the idea girl. I was the architect. Eleanor and I stepped out to confer. My head was spinning. "This is it, Maya," Eleanor said, her eyes bright. "This is victory. It's not everything we asked for, but it's more than we ever dreamed of when we drafted that clause. They're not just paying you to go away. They're paying for the asset, and they're paying for you to help them keep it valuable. You win." I looked back at the closed door, behind which Annee Petrova waited. I thought of David's smirk in the glass conference room. I thought of all the idea girl comments. This deal would give me financial freedom, professional vindication, and a continued, paid connection to my life's work. But signing it meant the story ended here. David would still get his payday, bigger than mine. He would still spin the tale of his triumphant sale. I would be a rich, satisfied footnote. Was that enough?
We walked back in.
I sat down across from Annee Petrovna. The terms are acceptable, I said, my voice firm. On one non-negotiable, structural condition. She raised an eyebrow, a flicker of impatience in her otherwise composed face. The entire settlement, the upfront payment, the royalty stream, the consultancy, must be structured as a direct purchase of the license from me, personally, to Kronos. It cannot be paid through Kennedy Corp. It cannot be part of the acquisition proceeds that David and the other shareholders receive. It is a separate, side agreement between Kronos and Maya Chen. The money comes from Kronos's coffers, not from the sale price of my old company. Annee studied me for a long moment, then a slow, understanding smile spread across her lips.
She saw it.
She saw the final, elegant twist. I wasn't just taking a bigger slice of the pie. I was making them buy a whole new pie, just for me before they could get the one they wanted. David wouldn't just be sharing his victory with me. He'd be watching me get rewarded from a completely separate pot of money that had nothing to do with him.
So, what do you think she said?
Did Kronos agree to my final, ego-shattering condition? Would you have taken the deal as it was, or pushed for that last symbolic point? The finale is next. Subscribe for part 5, where signatures are signed, fortunes change hands, and one final conversation changes everything. Annee Petrovna didn't answer me right away. She took a deliberate sip of her tea, placed the cup silently on its saucer, and let the weight of my final condition hang in the air of that quiet, wood-paneled room. She was recalculating. Not the money. That was a line item to a company like Kronos. She was calculating the message, the precedent, the subtle power dynamics. A direct payment from Kronos to me meant they were validating my claim as the true source of value, separate from the company David was selling. It was an acknowledgement that would ripple through the final deal documents, visible to David and his lawyers. It was the ultimate public vindication. Finally, she set down her cup. "All right," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion but resolve. "We can structure it that way. But the deal closes in 7 days. Your signature on our agreement is the trigger for everything else. No more conditions." The endgame had arrived. The next week was a blur of final drafts, frantic calls from David's camp trying to understand why the closing statements were shifting, and the quiet, meticulous work of tying the final knot. Eleanor and the Kronos legal teams worked around the clock to create 2 parallel agreement tracks. Track 1, the main acquisition agreement for Kennedy Corp, where David and the other shareholders would sell their shares for the agreed price. Track 2, the separate intellectual property license and settlement agreement between Kronos Technologies Incorporated and me, Maya Chen, personally. This document detailed the multi-million-dollar upfront payment, the 15-year royalty schedule, and the consultancy terms. It stated clearly that this agreement was in consideration for the grant of a perpetual, transferable license to the foundational IP as defined in Section 17.08, and that it was independent of and not part of the Kennedy Corp acquisition. David's lawyers, now fully aware of the separate deal, were apoplectic. They argued it violated the company's operating agreement, that it was a related party transaction that needed board approval. But they had no leverage. The board was dominated by David and his allies, who all wanted the main sale to close. If they blocked my side deal, Kronos would walk, and they'd get nothing.
They were forced to swallow it.
The bitterest pill for David was seeing the financial flows. A huge chunk of the total value Kronos was spending, value he thought was all for his company, was being siphoned off into a direct payment to me for an asset he suddenly realized he never truly owned. The day of the closing arrived. There would be no dramatic meeting. Signatures were digital, coordinated across time zones. I sat in Eleanor's office at my laptop. My inbox contained 2 emails. The first had the subject, Kennedy Corp acquisition, closing documents for signature. The second, Kronos Tech, IP license settlement, closing documents for signature. I opened the second one first. I scrolled past the legalese to the signature page. I took a deep breath, my finger hovering over the trackpad. This was it. Signing this would transfer the license, activate the payments, and end the war. It was everything I'd fought for. I clicked the signature field, typed my name, and hit submit. A quiet chime confirmed it was done. A wave of exhaustion, so profound it felt physical, washed over me. Then a strange, hollow calm. Eleanor, watching her own screen, nodded. It's done on our end. Kronos has countersigned. The funds will be wired to the escrow account and released to you within 24 hours. She looked at me, a real, warm smile breaking through her professional demeanor.
You did it, Maya.
You actually pulled it off. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clean. The poison of those years of resentment and dismissal was finally purged, not by a shout, but by a perfectly executed, legal maneuver that forced the world to see what I had always known. I then opened the first email, the one for the main acquisition. My signature here was a mere formality, releasing my 10% of the hollowed-out shell for its cash value. I signed it without a second thought. That chapter was closed. About an hour later, as Eleanor and I were going over the post-closing logistics, my personal phone buzzed. It was a number I knew by heart. David. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. And again. On the fourth call, I answered. I said nothing. His voice was raw, stripped of all its usual polished confidence. It was just shock and a dawning, horrible understanding. The wire hit, he said, his words stumbling over each other. The main deal money. It's there. But the numbers? Kronos' CFO just sent a breakdown. The total acquisition cost, it's millions higher than the purchase price. They listed it as a separate IP acquisition. That's you. That's your deal. He paused, and I could almost hear him shaking his head on the other end of the line, trying to reassemble a reality that had just shattered. You didn't just get a better deal. You made them pay for the company, and then you made them pay again, just for you. Outside of it, you were never really selling your 10%, were you? You were selling yourself. And you made me the guy who just sold you. I remained silent, letting him sit in the ruins of his own perception. Why? He whispered, the anger gone, replaced by a bewildered hurt. We built that together. At the start. Why go nuclear? Why not just come to me? That finally made me speak. My voice was quiet, steady, and utterly cold. You ended the partnership the moment you called me just the idea girl, David. You ended it when you presented me with a document that said I was worth 10% of my own mind. You didn't want a partner. You wanted an employee who owned a souvenir. I didn't go nuclear. I just showed you the foundation you were standing on was mine. And I charged you rent to keep standing there. I took a breath. Congratulations on the sale. I hope the view from your 90% is worth it. I ended the call. I blocked his number. There was nothing left to say. That was 3 years ago. The royalties still come in every quarter. The consultancy with Kronos lasted 2 fruitful years and ended amicably. I used the upfront capital to start a new venture fund, specifically for female and underrepresented founders in tech. I teach them about cap tables, about IP assignment, and yes, about the profound strategic power of reading and writing every single line of a contract. My story isn't a blueprint for revenge. It's a case study in leverage. David faded from the industry's spotlight. The Kennedy core product, under Kronos, became a reliable but unspectacular line of business. It never achieved the visionary heights it could have because its engine was no longer in the building. The real twist wasn't in paragraph 17. The twist was that the clause itself was just a mirror. It showed David and Kronos exactly what they had chosen to ignore, the intrinsic, non-negotiable value of the creator. So, what's the takeaway? It's not about hiding clauses to trick people. It's about having the clarity to define your own worth and the patience to build the unassailable structure that forces the world to agree with you. Have you ever had to fight to be valued for what you truly bring to the table? Share your story below. I read every comment. And if this story of quiet strategy over loud arrogance resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to remember their own power. Thanks for listening.